I mean, it's interesting. Brian Leiter, who has been a great supporter of the 316 project, the philosophy project, he's a he's an interesting scholar because he's an expert in Marxism and in Nietzsche, which they're not easily, well, you don't put them together. But his take on Nietzsche is really quite interesting because his argument about Nietzsche was that he wasn't post-truth in the sense that he was saying there isn't such a thing as truth or science. So Nietzsche was writing, as you know, in the 1850s and onwards, up until the breakdown in the 1880s. So there was a lot of there was Darwin, there was a lot of science going on, and Nietzsche was very into it and very supporting that. His thing, according to, this is Brian Leiter's thing, and it comes across in his Genealogy of Morals, was that it's not so much that the West is post-Socrates, post-Plato, he'd say, has become obsessed with truth, that it's the one value that dominates everything, and it gets in the way of all the other values like beauty, strength, well-being, health, love, all these other things that have nothing to do with truth, get sidetracked because we've become over-obsessed with truth. And so Nietzsche's point was, in an odd way, it wasn't so much relativism in the sense of there are different truths, but rather it was relativism in that there are different values, and why are you just obsessing about that one value? Yes, science needs, and as you pointed out, and as modern, Kuhn and everyone points out, even science doesn't come down with a certain truth. It's you keep an open mind. But if you call that, there's a thing called scientific whatever truth or whatever. He says, yes, there's that, and that's good. There's Darwin, and this is important, and there's this stuff, and there's physics, and it's weird, and it's wonderful, and there it is. But why is the West? Why put all your eggs in that basket? And listening to you talking about alternatives and this kind of stuff, one other way of looking at it, rather than just say relativist truth, which again, I think Nietzsche would say, you're still obsessing about truth. Leave truth alone. Because actually, when we read your thing, you're not just about truth. You're about how to live, how to die, how to mourn, how to be a nice guy, how to live well, how to eat, how to sleep. All the things, the massive things that, especially when I was reading your books from Nepal, and then the Japanese thing. Japan in particular, actually, that was the one that I really found interesting, because it was about how marriage works or how relationships between people work. And I was thinking, actually, I was plugging in with Brian Leiter's point about Nietzsche. I'm not really bothered about truth here. What I'm really bothered about is this seems to be a very different way of actually having friends, or having a wife, or having a child, or a son, or whatever it is, or business things. I wonder whether that actually might be an interesting, that Nietzschean point might also kind of soften the blow to those monotheistic Calvinist echoes that a lot of us in the West have got, where you say, well, you can have your truth, but don't let it kill you. Because I think that's what Nietzsche was.
Does he, the philosopher, talk at all about why he thinks, or why Nietzsche thinks this obsession with truth? I mean,
well, he puts it down to, Leiter says that when you read, Nietzsche, as you know, he's got this big thing about genealogy, and he looks at the way that certain language and thought has developed since Plato, and monotheism, and the history of culture through the West. And he says that what it's done is, and that's why he compares it. He does a bit like you. Nietzsche does the comparison. He says, look at Homer. So he goes to Homeric Greek, culture, and he says, compare that with what you've got with Socrates and Plato and Jesus, and there if you like, he says, there you've got the transition, as Nietzsche sees it, where in the Homeric Greece, the things that were valued was strength and heroism and being bold and glory and a whole load of things, which basically the opposite of what then the monotheists and it was the contrast between the asceticism of, and he called the planet, we became an ascetic planet once Christianity and monotheism and the truth obsession took over. Before that, we were in the hands of Dionysus, the god of excess, where it was all about the body, and you would find your well-being in being a good runner or looking after your body and being bold and proud and showing off all the things that we're told not to do in this other world. So it was a kind of comparative thing. Now, I don't know, I think some of this will be kind of probably turn out not to be historically as totally accurate, although Nietzsche was a philologist, whatever the word. Yeah, he was that before he was a philosopher, and the way he wrote was he was always trying to say, look, he was trying to get you out of this asceticism, which is exactly the kind of message that it seems to me you're saying, that if you go east, and again, Nietzsche was answering Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer had gone east, and he was very influenced with the Eastern philosophy, but Schopenhauer could see no positivity, and so he was saying, look, if you weigh up the world, the goods in the world with the bads in the world, the bads outweigh the good, you'd be better off not being born, and you might as well die. And Nietzsche was trying to answer that, and he's saying, look, if you go to a different culture, and he went to Homer and the Greeks pre-Plato, pre-Socrates, and pre the takeover of the monotheistic culture via Christianity and stuff. If you did that, you could see that there's an alternative. And he wasn't saying we've all got to go back to Homeric Greece. He was just saying, look, it's exactly your point. We're in a glass bottle. You can't see the cage, if you like, but you're in it. And we need to get out of it. And then he was quite interesting, because he would say the language itself that we use ratifies our views of what the world looks like. So it wasn't just language, it was the thought. But he was saying that, kind of the fact that we have subject object in our language, in English, and in the languages that we use in the West, means that we think about those in those terms. Whereas if you go, and you've said quite a lot, I think this is quite an interesting thing when I was reading about this, in your books, about the Chinese language and how it's very different, and it's a different worldview, and it's a different way of, and so it allows you to have the yin and yang.
It doesn't make a subject-object distinction to begin with.
Exactly, and this is Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche was onto something with this. Trouble is, he wrote.
Well, this all is part of the hidden injuries of modernity, because asceticism, which he's talking about, you're talking about, and of course Ernest talked about it a lot, the Puritanism of certain sects of Islam, and also David Hume's asceticism. That is one of the built-in features of if you separate things constantly. So as you hyper separate, then you have an area which is society, and you have an area which is politics, an area which is thought, and an area that is economy. Within the thought area, if it's entirely separated off from everything, the more it becomes separated off. It's separated off from religion and ritual, it's separated off from family and feelings, and so on. So the Puritan Revolution, which was the sort of ultimate expression of this, was a complete separation off of the mind. I mean, it's all in Descartes and so on, but of the mind from the body and from everything. And so you get more and more and more and more hyper concentration on whether it's truth or sort of thought, disembodied thought, separated off. And this was, of course, Ernest's conundrum, because on the one hand, he approved of this because he didn't want his thought or anyone else's thoughts to be subject to power from outside, political or religious. So he wanted to think freely. But he was also aware of the costs of this, that you lost all contact with anything meaningful in the world if you just went round and round like that. And so the problem with, obviously, with thinking about how to solve this in relation to modernity is how can you have the benefits and not throw them away while now in all the magic books and the autobiographical stuff, I've solved that in relation to quite a lot, in relation to the fact that we use our imaginations to heal many of the difficulties. We live in imagined worlds and we recreate meaning through poetry and art and games and so on and so on. So we don't live in the iron cage, Weber's iron cage. But that doesn't deal with all of it. And it's other bits that are interesting to try and explain to oneself, understand oneself first, and then to try and persuade someone in Oklahoma or Texas to share your views.